Welcome back to the Ellyn Institute's Early Weight Gain, Childhood Obesity, and Adult Disease Risk by Inez Anchondo, Pam Estes, and Ellyn Satter. We have a fantastic program for you today on infant weight acceleration and catch-up growth. I'm Carol Danaher, Board President of the Ellyn Satter Institute and Public Health Nutritionist in Santa Clara County, California. I wish to thank the Ellyn Satter Institute for sponsoring this extraordinary two-part webinar and recognize each of the speakers for donating their time and energy to this important topic in child growth. The Ellyn Satter Institute is a not-for-profit organization devoted to passing on the legacy of Ellyn Satter's feeding dynamics and eating competence models through education, training, and research. The organization is supported by product sales and charitable contributions. You can find a Donate tab on the home page. Most of you are familiar with our first speaker, Ellyn Satter. She is an internationally recognized eating and feeding authority. Dr. Inez Anchondo counsels children and parents and conducts research at the Texas Tech University Health Sciences Center in El Paso, Texas. She is a clinical faculty member of the Ellyn Satter Institute. Pam Estes is a registered dietitian at the Indianapolis Community Health Network and clinical faculty member of the Ellyn Satter Institute. Pam has applied Satter's feeding dynamics and eating competence models with children and adults for 17 years. Your certificate of participation will be available on the ESI website after today's webinar, and you'll get more details at the end of the program. Ellyn, I'm turning this over to you now.
Thank you, Carol. I think you can see me, and I am just getting my head organized. Oh dear. Well, hi everybody. It's so lovely to have you back here again today. And we've been having all these planning conversations before you arrive, so we're ready for you. We started this journey because of a good bit of current research suggesting that, in contradiction to the principles of the feeding dynamics model and the division of responsibility, that children can't be trusted to grow in a way that is right for them. Last week, Inez Anchondo concluded, after a really careful review of the literature, that any connection between early rapid weight gain and disease is spurious at most. She'll finish her literature review this week by considering the literature on child overweight. Now, relative to questions, you can type in your question at any point during the presentation. We're going to wait to answer the questions at the end of the presentation, except for Inez. We've invited her to address questions after she gets done with her part. But so type the questions in any time, and we'll answer them at the end. And at that point, Craig Burke will be our Executive Director of ESI, will be helping us with organizing those questions. This is the Ellyn Satter Institute position statement on child overweight. The position of ESI is that respect to prevention of child overweight, infants can be trusted to eat and grow well. Once again, Inez Anchondo is going to be scouring the research literature to test this assertion. And by the way, this is a hot link in your PDF printout that you have, the outline of the workshop. We're not going to follow the hot links to the website because we have found it tends to lock up our system, and then that's the end of everything. So Inez, over to you, and I gave you the mouse already.
Thank you so much, and I'm very grateful that a lot of you are back this week for more information. My part is going to be about maybe 2-3 minutes, and I'll review 3 slides on the most prominent studies on the relationship between rapid early infant weight gain and obesity. This first slide starts mentioning a lot of the studies that I've already mentioned to you last week, and the conclusion of all of these studies from analyzing early infant weight gain data and then later on data in childhood and also adulthood, most of them in early adulthood, 18 to 24 years of age, showed, and some of them like the Ellyn to 31 years of age, showed that the children that had an increase in weight for age z-scores in early in life associated with an increase in BMI and body fat later in life. And then there is this more recent study by Druet where there was a huge analysis, in fact, the meta-analysis of 10 big cohort studies that got to a whooping almost 48,000 participants. I tell you, there is strength in numbers. And so the results confirmed that infant weight gain correlated with weight gain later on in life, which is sort of, if we think about it, is sort of a logical conclusion. We expect children to track on their weight. However, putting together several studies as it was done in this study also means accepting all of the methodological flaws of each individual study. And it, as happens with meta-analysis, it's not always possible to know what or which study results are contributing more or less to the new results. This means a more methodologically flawed study could be contributing more to the results and not knowing, being able to determine the straightforward results of what is happening. What the results showed for this study is that for each one z-score increase in weight from 0 to 1 year of age, there is a twofold increased risk in childhood obesity and a 23% increased risk in adult obesity. And if we go to the next slide, Flagaman and also the review by Ong and Luz of the 21 studies, the systematic review by Ong and Luz also showed different percentages of what a early weight gain then resulted on the risk for obesity, adult overweight, sorry, in life. Now the issue with coming up with this results is twofold. We can see, you know, it can be translated in two different ways. Either you think that this is so high, and how many of these children are ending up with an increased risk for overweight, or understanding that more children actually should follow and track along instead of expecting less of them. What I mean by this is that considering that children follow an integrity of growth, then they should follow along a certain line through life. Expecting them to do less is almost not reasonable. Then if we look at, I'm sorry, I clicked too fast, I think.
Okay, I'll take you back. Where did you want to be?
Thank you. The next one.
All right, to the reality check.
Yes. So
okay.
in checking what is real, again, as I mentioned to you, growth tends to track. A lot of these studies also do not consider what how the growth is going. They just take one point. As we know, following the definition of overweight and obesity by the CDC, it's a cutoff point. And in many ways, doing it this way doesn't reflect exactly what's happening to the child. We need to follow and see where this weight is going. We also know that it is reasonable to believe that fast-growing infants and children of bigger parents, not only mothers, will be bigger in life because they have the genetics to be bigger. And then also, so we end up concluding that this data is just showing normal growth and is nothing to be alarmed about. Now, I reviewed all of the questions that came through last week. And the question that I want to answer, because I think I did answer it, but I'm going to repeat what I said. The question that was in the minds of a lot of participants last week was, is it breastfeeding babies? Is it formula-fed babies? And a lot of the studies, as I mentioned to you, concentrated on describing growth and in some of the variables that have to do with growth, maternal weight, gestational weight, gestational growth, or in birth weight, but socioeconomic status. But a lot of them did not consider both what the baby ate and or how the baby was fed. And so the two studies that consider that from last week was the studies that I mentioned to you in a lot of details, the two studies by Singal, the 2003 and the 2007 study, because his studies were about if one formula that has more protein and more fat in the case of the study of 2003, and then more protein in the case of the study in 2007, and the result of what happened with growth. And so the answer is we don't know. We don't know what would happen. The most promising study, the 2003 study, included breastfed babies, but this was the group of babies that was not randomized. So that the information is not available. I'm afraid I don't have an answer for that other than to say it'd be nice to have more studies that include what the baby eats and how it's being fed.
Right. So there are just a lot of unknowns in this.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you. And you're going to be here at the end so you can answer questions directed to you?
I'm excited to participate. Thank you.
All right, that's great. Okay, well, I'm going to take over and show you a few slides, and then Pam Estes is going to be doing the heavy lifting today with respect to this presentation. And so thank you so much, Inez. I really appreciate what you had to say. Okay, now we're returning to application, and you can, and I'm just going to let you read these objectives. Pam is going to be talking in detail about normal growth, or in more detail, so you can see what Inez is talking about. This is a hot link to the family meals focus that I did, contrasting and comparing normal catch-up growth with weight acceleration. Normal catch-up is child-driven, depends on a division of responsibility, pays attention to the child's internal regulators in guiding the feeding process, whereas weight acceleration is, as will be demonstrating results, shows up as an abrupt weight increase that is underscored by distortions in the child's biopsychosocial milieu. There's something going on in the child's life that is undermining that child's ability to regulate food intake. This is a review from last week, and Naz showed us these definitions of rapid early weight gain from the literature. And also last week, I applied these definitions to some children's growth records. And here's Adele. Despite the fact that she qualified for all early rapid weight gain infant definitions, including child obesity, Adele's smooth growth pattern indicates that this is normal catch-up growth. She is a twin. She was born small but well-nourished and grew rapidly the first year. Adele's parents followed a division of responsibility in feeding her and allowed her to grow her way. At age 13, she is a tall, lean, coordinated soccer player. Now, don't freak about these Z-scores. If you look at the list of handouts in the Ellyn Institute website under webinars, you're going to find a handout, a Family Meals Focus handout that addresses Z-scores, and it will tell you how you can calculate weight for age Z-scores if you don't have that already on your electronic medical record system. Maren, Adele's twin, qualified for 4 of the 6 designations of early rapid infant weight gain. Like her twin Adele, Maren achieved her normal growth potential within the first year. And so here she is. You know, she crossed over percentiles, and this Z-score chart exaggerates that, but it's exactly the same. And here she is at 9 months. She had increased considerably in her growth. Maren's parents followed the division of responsibility in feeding her as well. Now, they're not identical twins, so it doesn't always follow that each will be fed the same, but in this case they were. At age 13, she's moderate in height and weight and slender in build. Christopher, qualified for only 2 of the 6 risk designations and seemingly is growing quite smoothly and then accelerates across percentiles very smoothly. There's nothing abrupt about this until you put it on the Z-score chart, and here he is at 12 months. Let's see, 12 months. And he starts to accelerate. He just accelerates from around 0 to about 1. So he accelerates by 1 standard deviation. Keep an eye on the arrow where he is at 36 months of age. And so a different chart, same data. He has increased by about 1 standard deviation, and then he takes off like gangbusters. Chris's parents did a good job with feeding him until he became a toddler at that time. And here he is, you know, 12 to 18 to 20, 36 months. At that time, rather than establishing structure in feeding and including him in family meals, they continued to feed him on demand. And if you ever had a toddler in the house, you know how relentless that was. At that point, his weight started to increase rapidly. After this plotting, Chris's Z-score spiked to 3.0. Due to his early feeding errors, Chris's ability to internally regulate his food intake was undermined. He had learned to use food for emotional reasons, and you know how that goes. The toddler, you hand the toddler a cookie to quell the riot. When his family entered a time of severe emotional stress, Chris attempted to address his anxiety with food. His demands for food became relentless, and his weight rapidly increased. Chandra qualified for only 2 of the 6 risk designations, but her erratic weight gain raises the issue that there is something the matter. It reflects struggles around feeding. After she was weaned from the breast at around somewhere between 6 and 13 months, her parents began to see her as having a too big appetite. They began restricting her food intake and entered into constant struggles with her about her eating. And here she is at 36 months, a Z-score of just about 1. And from 36 to 43 months, she too rapidly increased weight by over 1 standard deviation. Like Chris, the early distortions in feeding dynamics undermined her ability to regulate food intake and grow consistently. So what are we looking at? In the first 2 cases, Adele and Maren, we were looking at catch-up growth, where the divergences were smooth and they leveled off, whereas in the last 2 cases, Chris and Chandra, we were looking at weight acceleration. And the key words here are abrupt and sharp, whereas divergence is not necessarily a problem, and Pam will be talking to you about questions you can ask to differentiate one from the other. So the moral of the story is that the data is only the beginning. To properly interpret growth, you need the backstory. And Pam, I am giving you the keyboard or the mouse, and it is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Ellyn. And thank you, Inez. I appreciate your updating of the literature. We had the happy occurrence of being in Boston in November of 2010 to give this this same presentation, and I so greatly benefited from all of the research that you reviewed then, and now that you've updated it, I'm in even better shape, so thanks. So as Ellyn said, data is the beginning, and you need the backstory. So getting the backstory necessitates a complete and thorough assessment. Luckily, this topic has been presented previously. Ellyn and Inez and I collaborated on a webinar in April of last year. And again, you got a hot link on your PDF that'll take you to that. Now, in each of the case studies that I'm going to be reviewing with you, by the time Inez and I received the referral to work with this family, the growth problems were already established. So doing the assessment and looking at all of the issues involved was very helpful, not only to the parent, but to the clinician. The parent knows that you have taken the time to review the case from birth, and the clinician gains invaluable information to help with understanding all of the complexities. Now, this appendix that you see here is from your child's weight, and it is one of your webinar handouts that you'll see on the ESI website. It discusses assessment, and specifically an assessment which includes a look at feeding and how feeding is going. And why is that important? Well, because weight acceleration can take place as a result of disruptions in many areas. However, feeding is always going to be affected, and the way the child is fed affects every other area of that child's life. So all of these areas need to be considered. And too often, addressing feeding problems is done piecemeal, without a full understanding of what the child and the parent have been through. So let's consider two case studies to demonstrate what growth and feeding assessment and intervention looks like when all of these areas are considered. To begin, let's evaluate Ellie's growth based on Inez's parameters. Here's her growth chart, birth to 21 months. And as you can see, early on, Ellie was already up at the 90th percentile, and then, oh my goodness, here she is in the uncalibrated area of the growth chart. So Ellie, really, both of these designations applied to her. When we look at her Z-score chart, we see that these two designations apply to her. However, when I look at this Z-score chart, the very first thing that pops out at me is this inconsistent growth. Now, we see the rapid weight gain, but it's in the context of early inconsistent growth. ME's story is similar, although her weight pattern is quite different. According to the second definition, her percentile weight per age plotting qualifies her for a diagnosis of obesity. And here she is at the 90th, but whoop, look how she's just taking off, and once again ending up in the uncalibrated area. She also qualifies as at risk based on these last two parameters. So at this point, it's good to pause and remind ourselves that it is normal for children to grow normally. And of course, by that we mean in an upward and predictable manner. So we're all comfortable with that upward predictable growth when it looks like this. It's steady, consistently tracking, and it's average at the 50th percentile. But how about this pattern? Again, we have upward, steady, and predictable growth. It's not average, but its consistency tells us it's normal growth for this individual child. Low and slow, but normal. Likewise, this growth is consistent. High and fast, but predictable, tracking along the 97th percentile. In both of our case studies, however, not only was the growth pattern inconsistent, both ME and LE's growth had accelerated, as you saw, into that uncalibrated section. So to get an accurate longitudinal growth pattern, we turn to z-scores. With this more clear way of representing ME's growth, we can begin to consider this question of how do we explain these shifts in growth? So by looking at the medical record and through parent report, we get a sense of how feeding was going for ME. And with ME, the feeding problems started at birth. The pediatrician told mom that ME was too big, and therefore she was not to feed her at night. Now we kind of wonder about that because look, her z-score is 0, which puts her right at the mean. So to understand the doctor's thinking, we have to go again to the percentile chart. And the weight for length chart shows us that ME was plump. She was at the 95th percentile. Looking at both, we see 50th percentile and 5th percentile. So the weight was at the 50th and the length was at the 5th, and that, of course, explains her plumpness. Now, what happened is that the doctor told the parent not to breastfeed at night because he was afraid of child overweight. Can you even imagine how disruptive being told not to breastfeed at night would be for ME and for her mother? And we know that developmentally newborns are working on homeostasis, learning how to calm and organize themselves in a busy world. So how easy would it be for ME to calm herself at night if breastfeeding was being withheld? We can easily imagine that she was a fussy baby, but her fussiness was interpreted as having trouble tolerating milk. So she was weaned from the breast by age 3 months and a succession of different formula introduced. You know the story. They were looking for the one that would soothe her. Her fussiness continued though. How many times have you seen this played out? Now, would all of this formula switching support ME in her developmental task of learning to calm and organize? And how about her mom? How about her mother's ability to help her to do that? In both cases, instead of helping with this developmental stage, the advice was profoundly undermining, and as well as being undermining of breastfeeding. So ME's mom was getting advice from multiple sources, as often happens, and WIC was one of them, and WIC encouraged her to start semi-solid food, thinking perhaps that would help with the fussiness. As you can imagine, mom was a bit ambivalent about this, and therefore she was inconsistent in her feeding methods. So all in all, ME's early feeding was erratic. It was up and down with solids, as well as with formula. And all the while, how is mom feeling? Discouraged, unsure. At 8 months, ME was eager to feed herself and insisted on eating. She shows that typical, almost toddler, intense desire to do it herself. Her earlier food restriction, and then her eagerness to eat, in combination with this diagnosis of asthma and the prednisone that was used to treat it, all combined to produce a rapid weight gain. But she had already had inconsistency following that, or preceding that, hadn't she? From 8 months to 23 months, there was little structure for feeding ME. As she moved into the toddler years, she would have benefited from routine of family meals. That meals plus snack routine would have been very reassuring to her. However, the structure was poor. Sometimes there were meals, sometimes not. And when there were meals, mom often tried to get her to eat less. But then, in between times, she would give in to her food demands. And as is typical with toddlers who are allowed to graze, ME learned to eat for emotional reasons. At 23 months, we see in the medical record the doctor notation of high weight and the recommendation to, quote, restrict food intake, unquote. Let's recap. For ME, every experience in her young life has been associated with hunger. Not being fed at night as a newborn, the back and forth with solid foods and formula as a young baby, not being able to rely on regular meals and snacks as a toddler. How do you think she is going to react to her mother's attempts to limit her intake? She's hungry and she's a toddler. Toddler's work in the world is to experience herself as separate. What happens to weight when toddlers and their parents get involved in this kind of struggle depends upon who gets the upper hand with the eating. And ME's constant demands wore her mother down. She would try to follow the doctor's orders and restrict, but then she'd give in. So she told Inez that when she didn't give her sugary foods, ME would help herself to sugar from the sugar bowl. In addition, this mom was concerned about ME's asthma, and that led her to keep her indoors and try to keep her quiet. That didn't let either one of them get out and have a chance to work off some of the stress, because struggles around feeding are stressful for both parents and for children. Now, this seeming leveling off between 18 and 23 months is just an artifact from going from the earlier growth chart to the next one. When Emmy was 33 months old, the pulmonologist declared that she did not have asthma and took her off the meds. However, the pulmonologist stressed to mom that ME, quote, must lose weight. Was more restriction the answer? For the next 4 months, between 33 and 37 months, this chaotic pattern of restricting, then giving in continued. Now, at 37 months, Inez introduced mom to Satter's division of responsibility. And as most of you know, for the toddler, that means that the parent is in charge of the what, when, and where, and the child is in charge of the how much and the whether. Mom immediately liked it, but as you can imagine, by this time there were many family voices that were encouraging her to restrict ME and try to get her to lose weight. So it actually took about 6 months for her to adapt to it. In addition, Inez encouraged mom to let ME go outside and play. Now that too, after years of protecting against overexertion, took time for mom to feel comfortable doing. But we begin to see the leveling off of her weight acceleration. And that tells us something that you probably already know, and that is that children are resilient and they will make changes in response to the changes that their parents make. ME's mom had Inez's support as she made her changes, which is very important, because how do you think a child who has been restrained for 33 months will react to being able to eat as much as she wants at meals and snacks? Eating is likely to get worse before it gets better, and will only get better when children trust that their parents will no longer try to get them to eat less than their internal cues dictate. So here we see the leveling off of weight in response to following the division of responsibility. So we've discovered the story that the growth chart tells us. Emmy's weight per length plotting at the 95th percentile worried the doctor. Like many healthcare professionals, he thought it was necessary to take action to ward off childhood overweight, and so he recommended restricting her intake. In actuality, that restriction disrupted breastfeeding, and it interfered with her mother's ability to support ME in self-regulating her eating. ME's hunger and her fear of hunger is what drove her eating and her food demands, and that was what overpowered her mother's ambivalence about restricting her. Without a structure of regular meals and snacks, ME's food concerns were heightened, and her mom had absolutely no way of reassuring her that she would be fed besides giving in to her. So this restraint, followed by reactive overeating, is what caused ME's weight gain. After 5 months of following the division of responsibility, Emmy's mother noticed a decrease in Emmy's food preoccupation. She would leave food on her plate at meals. She didn't complain when her mom gave her water in between meals and snacks. And by 9 months of following the division of responsibility, Emmy's mother reported that Emmy could run better and for a longer time. We all probably have a few places that we'd love to do a do-over. So let's take advantage of the fact that we can do a little fantasy thinking right now. If we had the chance for a do-over with Emmy and her mom, which incorporated attention to feeding dynamics, this is what it would look like. I'll let you read through the points. I also think you should circle this slide. And the reason for that is because I think it summarizes beautifully implementing a treatment that is feeding dynamics, that includes feeding dynamics. Now, interestingly, the feeding problems that started at birth with Emmy and her mom, and that we saw reflected pretty clearly on the Z-score chart, weren't that apparent on the percentile charts. However, had we been there from the early months, we could have taken our cue from the feeding problems. We could have asked feeding questions and hopefully just headed off years of struggle. Now, these are feeding questions. You probably have your own, and you'll probably come up with more. But I love this one about what is it you would like to be different about feeding your child. By the time she was 24 months old, the acceleration had begun, and so there was a shift that we needed to investigate. But that's the important point. At this point, we would not be diagnosing. We would be investigating. Is it a normal shift, or is there a problem with feeding? And once again, asking feeding questions is how we would get our answers. So let's try ourselves out on another case study. This is Ellyn, and I met her when her weight was already up here in the uncalibrated area at 18 months. What do you think, normal or abnormal growth? If you could see me, you would see a big smile on my face, because obviously there are pretty abrupt shiftings going on here and rapid crossings of percentiles. And it's not just up here that's the problem. Of course, this is uncalibrated, but down here we see shifts as well. And so here again is her weight for age Z-score growth pattern. And now I get the chance to investigate with you what was going on to cause such a rapid up and down. You see it here too. Unlike MEs. These are the places that we'd want to be asking our questions. What's going on here? What's going on here? Is it normal or something that needs some intervention? And the medical record provided the answers. Ellyn had difficulty latching on, and breastfeeding was difficult. At 8 days, the doctor recommended 2 ounces of formula every 4 hours. Now, what does putting a newborn on a schedule do as the infant works to calm and organize? And again, how do parents learn to support the child? How do they recognize sleep states and feed during the time that the infant is most alert if they're going by a schedule and breaking into sleep states? Mom said that Ellyn took to the bottle right away. And by 1 month of age, Mom was waking her up every 3 hours to feed her 3 ounces of formula. But what about the spitting up? At 4 months old, Ellyn was started on fruits and vegetables and chicken soup with rice in it. That was standard fare for the family, who was from Colombia. She continued on a schedule for bottle feeding, though, and spitting up was still a problem. Who is determining the how much for Ellyn? We begin to wonder about overfeeding. And for the infant, the division of responsibility is very straightforward. Parent in charge of the what, and the child in charge of everything else, including the how much. A little background information for you is that Ellie's dad worked several jobs, and he was gone all day long and into the night. And when Ellie was 5 months old, her mom went to work from 5 p.m. to 1 a.m. So Ellie and her older sister are left with an uncle, and Dad picks them up around midnight. By 8 months, Ellie was enthusiastically feeding herself, and Mom was really happy to see her progressing so well. But at 9 months, the doctor noted in the medical record high weight and the fact that the doctor had discussed the risk of diabetes with the family. The doctor's recommendations at that point were to decrease formula at night and wean to a cup. At 11 months, Mom was instructed to limit juice to no more than 8 ounces a day, as that was probably contributing to the rapid weight gain and diarrhea. And interestingly, we see on the Z-score chart that the weight was actually coming down, but the doctor didn't have access to the Z-score chart. And so when Ellie was 18 months old, I met with the family after receiving a referral that I'll never forget, because it read, "She eats everything and all the time. Please work with the family around the right foods to eat and establish an exercise program for Ellie to lose weight." At my initial meeting with Mom, she said she had no concerns about Ellie's eating or her weight, but she knew that the doctor was concerned, and that concerned her. She also hastened to tell me that children in her family were chubby. They weren't fat. But she did admit to having a concern of her own. She was concerned that Ellie wasn't eating enough. She was concerned that her uncle wasn't trustworthy about getting dinner on the table. And so to compensate, Ellie's mom made her clean her plate and let her graze throughout the day. So the answer to this problem was not a diet. The heart of the division of responsibility is the structure of regular meals and sit-down snacks. This family had meals, but because of the parents' work schedule, there were long times in between, and a mother who worried about their getting enough. The answer was not cutting down on amounts fed, but adding in structure. So we added 2 planned sit-down snacks, one before Mom left for work and one before Ellie went to bed. Mom stopped making her cleaner plate and gave her water only in between eating times. We got a booster seat for Ellie we got a booster seat for Ellie's sister, and Ellie got the high chair. Now they both sat up at the table to eat with their parents. So I worked with this family for 5 months to establish the division of responsibility, and Ellie's weight came down, but not because we changed the food she was eating or added in an exercise program. And you can imagine at 18 months she was pretty active anyway. But her weight came down because she had simply stopped overeating. In the process, her mom traded in guilt and overcompensation for taking a real leadership role in feeding both of her children. So again, looking at the Z-scores and asking feeding questions, we're able to discover the story that the growth chart reveals. And so that initial drop in weight that we saw with Ellie, that was a feeding problem. And the way it was handled set the stage for the later divergence and the poor feeding practices that continued until 18 months. Very interesting to me that at 9 and 11 months, the doctor gave very standard feeding recommendations: decreasing formula at night, weaning to a cup, limiting juice. However, within the context of the family's life circumstances and the mom's overriding concern that she provide for her children, those recommendations had the opposite effect from what the MD intended. So let's take a closer look at the poor feeding practices and the changes that Mom was able to institute. Very, very happy development was that the family saved money because they didn't have to buy as much milk. Once the family stopped putting the milk cup in the refrigerator that the 2 girls just helped themselves to, a gallon of milk lasted 3 to 4 days instead of 2. And so we conclude with these recommendations. Early weight divergence is a sign of distorted feeding, so keep an eye on the growth chart. It tells the story of the child's physical, nutritional, and developmental well-being. Use z-scores to plot growth that goes off the percentile charts. And at the first sign of growth divergence, investigate by finding out what's going on with feeding. There may be a problem, or this may just be a normal growth adjustment. Likewise, investigate feeding problems, including parental dissatisfaction with how feeding is going. Do that again by asking feeding questions. If struggles with feeding persist, they cause distortions in eating attitudes and behaviors, which can destabilize weight throughout life. And in my current work with adults, I find that to be the case. To correct distorted feeding dynamics and weight instability, teach developmentally appropriate, stage-related feeding, regardless of where the child's weight plots on the growth chart. And then the work begins, because then we need to trust the growth process and also help parents to do the same. So I am going to end here and turn it back over to Carol, who will tell you what comes next.
Thank you, Pam, Ellyn, and Inez. This was a wonderful, serious, and in-depth discussion. So I'm going to turn you over again. We're going to go to Craig Burke, our Ellyn-Satter Institute Executive Director. Craig?
Thank you. Hi, everybody. So I want to take a moment before we get to questions to introduce you to our website, which is ellynsatterinstitute.org. And if you've not been there before, or perhaps you're familiar with our previous website, the Ellyn-Satter Associate website, this is our new home on the web. And there are a couple of things I'll walk you through here. The first is that we are an institute with walls, and we devote ourselves to passing on the legacy of Ellyn-Satter's feeding dynamics model and the Ellyn-Satter eating competence model through education, training, and research. So some of you may already be familiar with our features under the feeding and eating section, information on how to feed children, as well as information on how to eat. We also have our newsletter resources, which is the Family Meals Focused newsletter. You may find those useful if you've never seen those before. We have a slew of other resources under the Resources tab, and I specifically want to point out the position statements. Moving along the line here, we have the Speaking and Training section. Our faculty, and that includes the Pam Estes, who you've just heard from, are available for keynotes and and workshops. And so that is something you may want to consider if you have training needs or other goals around that. Next is the webinar section. Some of you have asked where to get the handouts from today. Well, that would be under the webinar section here. And there's a link here for the handouts. And then I want to point out that we do have our resources, Ellyn-Satter's books, DVDs, and materials available under the shop section of our website. And specifically, I want to point out that there are different categories here for you to browse. I mentioned the videos. And there are handout packages, books you can buy by the case, and other continuing education needs that may be of use to you. And then lastly, Carol mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, in many ways our organization is supported by donations, and you can give to our organization via the donate tab. Through PayPal, you can give via credit card, or you can send a check to the address on our homepage, which is right here. So thank you for allowing me to share that information with you. And with that, we'll get to some questions. I see there aren't quite as many as there were in the first webinar. So let's see. First question is about high-calorie formulas. And they're wondering if you all have an opinion about high-calorie formulas.
Well, this is Pam, and obviously it's a question that I would like a little bit more background of what the particular use was going to be. One of the things that I saw repeatedly was a high-calorie formula taking the place of moving along in a developmentally appropriate manner, that parents and children alike can get stuck there. And so, again, making sure that it's within the structure of meals and snacks would be the way that I would address, say, Pediasure usage or things of that manner. When it's high-calorie formula for newborns, then they're going to be, as long as you follow their cues, they're going to be able to do just as good a job, regardless of whether it's calorie dense or regular.
Inez, are you still there?
Yes, I get. It'd be nice to have a little bit more context on the question, but definitely is very popular to concentrate the formula and to 22 calories. There's even a formula already available for premature babies, InfaCare 22, and it's like I said, very popular to do this. It is my experience that as expected, physiologically expected, most babies adjust. And so if you give them a more concentrated formula, then they're going to drink a little bit less. So that's been my experience, but it doesn't stop clinicians to want to do it when these babies are not gaining as fast or as needed. And then there is also definitely a need for concentrated formulas in the case of babies that need to have volume restrictions or volume limits. So again, knowing the context of the question will be a little bit more helpful, but that I hope this answer it's satisfying.
Well, Inez, last week you talked about some of these early rapid weight gain studies identified that their babies were getting the enriched formulas, the high caloric density or high protein formulas.
Yeah, there was a study by Singal on that, yeah.
And we felt like that was another variable in trying to figure out what really is going on with these babies, because they're being fed these high caloric density formulas, and if they've been small for gestational age or prematurely born, then the chances are they're likely not being fed according to a division of responsibility in feeding.
That's correct, and you also point this out in your family meals focused newsletter, where you talk about the how to feed as well, and you describe the protocol by Ross and Philbin on addressing not only what these babies but how these babies are fed, because as I mentioned before, in some of these cases there's no doubt in our minds, and I include a lot of the audience as well, that these babies need to be force fed, otherwise they don't really eat. And so that's I want to bring that up for the audiences to look into where you describe that protocol.
I'm glad you mentioned Ross and Philbin, because it's an excellent article, and they're taking a real leadership role with feeding with these infants in the NICUs, and I hope that sometime we can get them to do a webinar for us.
Yes, that's right.
Well, Craig, I think we've managed to answer that question.
Yes, great job. Thank you all. Couple more questions, but first I just wanted to share a wonderful compliment that you all are receiving. This person says, "Thank heaven for these webinars. They keep me sane in an era of pediatric obesity hysteria. Thank you from the bottom of my heart." What a kind compliment.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
I think they probably do the same thing for us. Thank you for that compliment.
Yes. Yeah. Next question says, in your experience, what is the most common cause of disruption in feeding and the feeding relationship in the first year of life and in the toddler years?
Oh, I love that question, but That's a good thought question, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
First year of life. Well, homeostasis. I think failure to identify and understand the child's developmental needs at any stage of development. For instance, what is appropriate feeding for the infant, where you pay attention to information coming from the child and kind of make them the star and drop everything and feed them when they're hungry, is absolutely the wrong feeding when with a toddler who needs structure and has the developmental task of joining the social world of the family. That's one question. So Pam, Inez, what do you think? For one answer.
I would say that also not recognizing what the parents' responsibilities are with regards to feeding, wanting to do both the when they're infants, wanting to do the choosing of what they're going to feed and also amounts and imposing amounts early on. That's you know, very much an issue that I can see, because they've been told, especially in these very small babies, that they, you know, the parents have been told that they need to be giving a certain amount. And so that's not recognizing and applying the division of responsibility in infants. I think it's also an issue.
I agree. And Ellyn, as I've told you many times, learning about child development and how it informs feeding was like the magic key for me. So I couldn't agree with both of you more. The other thing I would say is just to highlight on the compliment that we got is that there is a lot of pressure on parents out there. They are just so determined to do it perfectly, and you know, perfect doesn't exist, as you've taught me. But being sensitive and flexible does. And so being sensitive enough to recognize that something is not working for you and your child, and then flexible enough to try something else. So that means that they have to pay real attention to what the child's behavior is telling them, as opposed to trying to relentlessly continue with some advice that may be undermining.
We could go on quite a while with this question, Craig, but I think you better move us along.
Well, great. Looks like we have time for one, possibly two more questions, but let's go to this next question. It says, how do you introduce the SATR research models, SATR/models, to MDs and PhDs involved in obesity initiatives in pediatrics?
Oh, wow. I'm going to write a family meals focus about this. And I would suggest, and I let me set up what I think is the context, because it's a single child, and the health professional says this child is too fat, kind of like what happened with Ellyn, and needs a weight loss diet. She's eating too much, so you have to do something. And so I think rather than jumping in and trying to persuade the referring person that they need to follow a division of responsibility and so on, I would take it upon myself to do an evaluation, whatever level of assessment you can possibly manage with that particular child, so you can tell the doctor in detail what is going on with this child that is making her gain weight too fast. And you know, doctor wants a diet, maybe they're determined to have a diet, and you can say, well, you know, as a first step, I think these issues need to be corrected. That the family, well, let's just think about Ellyn, that the family meals are chaotic, that the mother is so concerned that the daughter isn't going to eat enough, that she lets her graze for food and makes her clean her plate. And you can say this is what I would recommend, is that we start with these issues, and see what kind of results we get. And so you're not going to you probably aren't going to have to cross the food restriction bridge if you can give a good explanation for what's going on with this child and give some ways of addressing it. That's my idea. I'm very interested to hear from you, Inez and Pam, what you think about that.
I agree with your answer.
I do too. And I can tell you that from talking to the doctors when I was working with a child, that they had no idea sometimes how their advice was being applied and were really rather shocked. So that gives an opening as well.
Right. Yeah, I don't think you have to reorient other people, that you do help them to do with themselves what we've done with ourselves, and that is enter the situation through the individual child and then do the problem solving, and then and it brings you then to a feeding dynamics perspective rather than trying to persuade the other person of the feeding dynamics perspective up front.
Well, thank you all. Looks like we're out of time here, but thanks for answering those questions, and thank you all for submitting your questions.
Thank you, Craig.
Yep.
Thank
Goodbye,
you.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.